please lead into Zechariah 12 and what you call the climactic conclusion of Psalm 83 war.
Okay. All right, let's do that. I'm going to read Zechariah 12. Well, let me kind of summarize first before we get into the details. Zechariah 12, verse 2 talks about a time coming when Jerusalem will be made by God as a cup of trembling or dizziness in some translations to all the surrounding peoples round about when they lay siege against Judah and Jerusalem. And he's clearly talking about, with the Hebrew word saviv, the neighborhood, the peoples round about. Matter of fact, when you study this word, and it's important to do this because what happens as we study Zechariah 12, verses 3 and verse 9 almost sound like maybe we're talking about Armageddon, but the reality is we can break this down where we're really not talking about that final Armageddon campaign. We're actually talking about something probably related to Psalm 83 that could happen in the very near future and conclude the Arab-Israeli conflict. I think this should be the climactic concluding aspect of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the utter destruction of the evil neighbor nations in fulfillment of Jeremiah 12, verse 17. So, Janie, I think it's important to understand who we're actually identifying in Zechariah 12, verse 2, that are going to attempt to lay a siege against Judah and Jerusalem. Basically, we're talking about the evil neighbors that we've been pointing out in this video. So several versions clearly make this sound the case. It's the surrounding peoples in the New International Version. It'll be a cup of intoxication to the nearby nations. They'll stagger when they send their armies to besiege Jerusalem. The New Living Translation. I'll read a couple more real quickly. The New American Standard, he calls them the cup of reeling to all those peoples roundabout. I could go on and read every translation in the Bible. It talks about the surrounding peoples, the neighbors, so on and so forth. Matter of fact, we're even told in one of the first usages of the term, in Genesis 23, verse 17, it says that they were in the neighbors around Israel. They were at all the borders round about. So we're talking about the bordering nations, just to make the point I'm trying to establish here.
Right. If not, so that it's not being Armageddon and really being part of the Psalm 83 war.
Right, in that verse. Now, here's where it gets confusing for some people. They go into the next verse. It says, and in that day, now let's break that down. In that day, in the day that the nations round about that share common borders with Israel, the evil neighbors, when they attempt to lay siege on Judah and Jerusalem, in that day, and in that day I'll make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people, now not just the surrounding people, but the international community at large. And all that burden themselves with it shall be cut in pieces, although all the people of the earth are gathered together against it. And that can also mean assembled against it. And so I would break that down to what I'm saying here is basically, as we see this climactic concluding aspect of the Arab-Israeli conflict, they're going to make a final siege against Judah and Jerusalem. Remember, Jerusalem is the third holiest city in Islam, even though it's not mentioned one time in the Quran. That's where the Temple Mount is. That's where they have their mosque, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the Dome of the Rock. So they're going to try to protect that and lay a final siege against Judah and Jerusalem. And the international community is going to meddle. They're going to clamor about that. We've already seen this happen in 1947, the United Nations, when it came to Jerusalem. They would not allow it to be the capital of Israel. Israel is going to become a nation, but the United Nations said it's going to be an international zone. And then in 1948, the Arabs went to war with the Jews in the War of Independence, and they lost. And then we had the armistice agreement, which is when they drew the line of demarcation, the green line that divided Jerusalem in half. And that is not biblically endorsed. The dividing of Jerusalem is not biblically endorsed. And it didn't last more than 20 years because in 1967, in the Six-Day War, Israel took over Jerusalem, all of Jerusalem. Now, they made the colossal mistake of giving control over the Temple Mount to Jordan. So they're paying a price for that even today. And then you go on and talks about you see our presidents, Bill Clinton around 2000 tried to make a two-state solution, give East Jerusalem to the Palestinians. That failed. George Bush tried the same thing. 2014, John Kerry as the Secretary of State with Barack Obama, he tried the same thing. It failed. Joe Biden is trying the same thing. Matter of fact, as we see this getting worse in the Gaza right now, with Israel really winning that war in the Gaza right now against Hamas. We're starting to see the international community clamoring again. You need a ceasefire. Don't hurt the civilians. Even got Belgium and some European countries coming out right now saying we are not going to allow the Israeli settlers to come over to our lands. Now we're talking because of the West Bank. There's violence going on in the West Bank between the Palestinians there and the Israeli settlers. So we're seeing that as things get worse, and the Gaza Hamas area, we're told in Zephaniah chapter 2, is actually part of Judah. It's going to be for flocks for Judah and the Messianic kingdom. So we talk about laying siege on Judah and Jerusalem. We're seeing that Israel is already winning the war in parts of what will be Judah's tribal territory, and the international community is in an uproar, and even Biden is saying, then you can go ahead and win your war against Hamas, but you're going to have the Palestinian Authority that's going to have to rule over there. Don't take it over and rule over yourself. No, Netanyahu's going, it's going to be a demilitarized zone that we're going to take care of because we can't trust the Palestinian Authority to run that area because they're not friends of Israel as well. So it goes on talking about the meddling of the international community. But what's very interesting is it goes on to say in verse 4, another in that day. So in that day that they seize on Judah and Jerusalem, the neighbors round about, the evil neighbors, and the world is clamoring, and it becomes a burdensome stone that the Lord is saying, don't try to move it and don't try to meddle because it's going to grievously hurt you if you do. That was verse 3. And that's where a lot of people start thinking, well, now we're talking about Armageddon because all the nations are talked about here.
But you're saying all the nations is just meddling. It's not all the nations as Armageddon war against Israel.
Right, and we're going to come back to that, time permitting, to show where they connect Zechariah 14, 1 through 3, especially verse 2 of Zechariah 14, thinking that finds affiliation here, and I'm going to show the differences that it absolutely doesn't. It says, in that day when they try to lay siege, the evil neighbors on Judah and Jerusalem, the Lord's going to divinely intervene on behalf of Israel, and he's going to actually work in concert with the Israeli Defense Forces. We find out in the next 2-3 verses, Zechariah 12, 14, Zechariah 12, verse 4 through Zechariah 12, verse 6. And here's what it says. Zechariah 12, we're going to break it out into 14. Zechariah 12, we'll break verse 4 into A, B, and C. A, in that day, the Lord says, I will strike every horse with confusion and every rider with madness. I will my eyes on the house of Judah, and I will strike every horse of the peoples with blindness. So he's talking about intervening. He says, I will do these things. I will strike every horse with confusion. Now, they're not going to be riding in the Arab neighbors on horseback. Of course, back in Zechariah's time, they didn't have tanks and planes and things like that. So he used the idiom of war that he had, the transportation of war that they had back then, and that was horses. And I'm going to tell you what I believe he's saying here. The Lord's going to intervene. I will do this thing. He says, in that day I will strike every horse with confusion. And so it appears the first thing he does to level the playing field against the vast Arab armies coming against Israel, who's been hurt by Isaiah 17. The glory of Jacob had faded. The fatness of his flesh had grown lean. They're going to lay siege. The international community is going to meddle and be in an uproar, and the Lord's going to get involved. And that's why he warns the international community, don't get involved. It'll be a burdensome stone. He says, I'm going to strike every horse with confusion. So first it appears that the Lord causes the Arab artilleries, tanks, and armors vehicles to malfunction. He says, I will strike every horse with confusion. Now, that has biblical precedent, Jamie, and I'm going to read you an account historically in Exodus chapter 14, verses 24 through 25. But it says, now it came to pass, this is when Moses was leading the Hebrews out of Egypt, and their backs were against the Red Sea. And Pharaoh and his armies were ready to get them in the morning. And of course, the big pillar of cloud stood between the Hebrews and Pharaoh's army, protecting the Hebrews at the Red Sea. And it says in Exodus 14, now it came to pass in the morning watch that the Lord looked down upon the army of the Egyptians through the pillar and fire and cloud, and he troubled the army of the Egyptians. And here's what he did. And he took off their chariot wheels so that they drove them with great difficulty. And the Egyptians said, let us flee from the face of Israel. The Lord fights for them against the Egyptians. So he intervened divinely back then, like he's going to intervene divinely and cause the artillery and things to malfunction in Zechariah chapter 12, verse 4a. And of course, the Egyptians knew that was the God of the Jews. And then some of them said, we need to flee. He's fighting for them. So he took, I like to say, he took the lug nuts off the chariots so that the Egyptian, now these chariots were world renowned. The Egyptian chariots back at that time were the most advanced chariots in the world. They would have had no problem coming and destroying the Hebrews at the Red Sea had this not happened and had the Red Seas not parted.
Wow.
So we see he's gonna use biblical precedent and level the playing field right there.
Okay, so, and that's in Zechariah 12, verse 4 that you're explaining in detail, which is still like a fulfillment, is a fulfillment of Psalm 83.
Yeah, so in that day again, we're talking used again. Jerusalem's going to be sieged by the Arabs, a burdensome stone to the international community. God's going to get in the middle. He's going to level the playing field. That was Zechariah 12, 4a. Zechariah 12, 4b goes on to say, when I will strike every horse with confusion and its rider, the soldiers, the troops, with madness. So in other words, when the troops coming from all the different evil neighbors to lay siege against all the surrounding peoples round about, to lay siege against Judah and Jerusalem with their vast armies, thinking they're going to win, when they see that the malfunctions are going on in all of their equipment and artilleries, they're going to panic. And they're going to be very concerned, like the Egyptians panicked and were very concerned. This also happened with Gideon and the Midianites back in the book of Judges, chapter 7, verses 20 through 22. I get into these comparisons in my Future Wars Prophecies book, and for time's sake, I won't read that account. But at that time, Gideon and his 300-man army, and by the way, Asaph petitions for this kind of military precedent in Psalm 83, verses 9 through 11. This is how Asaph petitions the Lord militarily to level the playing field in Psalm 83 against the Arab countries and divinely empower the Israeli defense forces to win the war. And so we see that the account is going to be very similar to what happened in Judges when Gideon with his 300-man army, with the help of the tribe of Ephraim, took out 120,000 Midianites. And they had torches and pitchers and their trumpets, and they 300 men put the torches in their pitchers and blow their trumpets and say, the sword of the Lord, and Gideon start shouting, and 120,000 Midianites started panicking, killing one another and fleeing.
Very supernatural.
It's the same thing that's going to happen, and we're going to probably see this if this happens during the church age. We're going to see the Lord divinely, supernaturally intervene and level the playing field, cause malfunctions in the artillery of these Arabs. They're going to cause panic and madness. And then it's not over. Zechariah 12, verse 4c goes on to say, and I will strike every horse of the peoples with blindness. So he's dealing again with the equipment, the tanks and the planes, etc., per se. And what he's going to do there says, the Lord will turn his favor toward the Israeli defense forces, and somehow the guidance, radar capabilities of the enemy's tanks, jets, rockets, etc., will become disabled. I will strike every enemy horse of the peoples with blindness. So malfunctions creates hysteria among the troops, and guidance systems go out. Now that, and we're told in Zechariah 12, verse 5, goes on, that says, and the governors of Judah, the captains, shall say to the IDF, if you will, shall say in their heart, the inhabitants of Jerusalem are my strength, and the Lord of hosts their God. It says, fourth, the IDF will become emboldened to battle as they witness the enemy's equipment malfunction. The Arab armies panic, and they will gain courage as they focus on their fight to regain sole sovereignty over Jerusalem. That's verses 1 through 5. Now, verse 6 is really important, and this tells us, again, we're talking about, it's important to realize who we're talking about here. It says, in that day, again, in that day, we're still focused on what's happening around the time of the siege against Judah and Jerusalem. We're going to find out that this siege is unsuccessful with the Arab countries round about, the evil neighbors. It says, in that day, I will make the governors or the captains of Judah like a firepan in the woodpile, like a fiery torch in the sheaves. And they shall devour all the surrounding peoples, the evil neighbors, not the world at large, on the right hand and on the left, but Jerusalem shall be inhabited again in her own place. So as this builds up, as the Arabs make a final attempt to lay siege on Judah and Jerusalem, verse 2, Zechariah 12, the international community gets heated up, tries to meddle, as they've already got a history of doing since Israel became a nation. And we're seeing it happen unfold presently with this war with Hamas and Israel. And then they're going to come against Judah and Jerusalem, and the Lord is going to intervene and level the playing field. And then the Israeli Defense Forces are going to get emboldened. They're going to get confident when they see the Lord is working on their behalf and empowering them. And then what's going to happen is they're going to go to war. And the governors of Judah, the Hebrew word is Eluf, Aluph. That is actually the term of a high military ranking leader in the Israeli Defense Forces today, Aluf. So he's talking about the Israeli Defense Forces. They're going to win the war. The battlefield is going to be like a fire pan in the woodpile. The Israeli Defense Forces is going to be like a fiery torch in the sheaves, and the Arab armies that have already been hurt by the Lord, divine intervention, are going to be like they're going to be devoured like sheaves. So we know who's going to win that war, and Israel's going to devour the ones on the right hand and on the left hand. Now, some people would say this is dealing with all the nations of the world, so we're going to address that in a second. But it's not Israel Defense Forces defeating the kings of the East that are coming to join the Antichrist and Armageddon, America, Russia, Japan. It's dealing with the evil neighbors of surrounding people. We're going to find out that the Israeli Defense Forces are not involved in Armageddon at all. And that's where some people try to put this stuff. But what we find here is those first 6 verses is the conclusion, in my estimation, of Psalm 83, the Arab-Israeli conflict, militarily, not through politically brokered peace deals.
It totally makes sense to me. I mean, your book is amazing. Everyone needs to get a copy of the Future War Prophecies, because there's so many more details in that book.
And we want your viewers, Janie, you had told me when we started talking before the airing this program, and I agree. Everybody pretty much for the last 2,000 years have not interpreted it the way we just interpreted it on your show. They've looked at Zechariah 12, 1 through 6 here, actually 1 through 9, as part of the Armageddon campaign. And what we're doing here is really revolutionary. We're saying it's not. The Lord, when he causes malfunctions in the artilleries and hysteria among the soldiers and guidance defaults in the equipment, military equipment, he's not doing it to all the nations of the world, which is what would have to happen at Armageddon. He's doing it to the surrounding peoples that were clearly told on the right hand and on the left hand. Very definitive. So, but here's a couple of really good quotes from very top scholars today. Mark Hitchcock, in his book called The End, says, Armageddon is the climactic war of the Great Tribulation, when all the armies gather to attack Israel and attempt to finally eradicate the Jewish people. They will capture Jerusalem, but then Jesus Christ will return to destroy the invading armies and deliver the faithful Jewish remnant. The War of Armageddon is the subject of many biblical passages, and he goes Joel 3, 1 through 7, which I agree. Zechariah 12, 1 through 9, which I disagree, but see, he puts it there. Zechariah 14, 1 through 15, we'll look at Zechariah 14 in a moment. I agree, that's got something to do with that, Armageddon. Revelation 16, that's where the kings of the East gather against the dried up Euphrates River. That would be like the Asian countries, China probably, coming to assemble at Armageddon. That's the 6th bowl judgment. I agree. Revelation 19, I would agree also. That's when Jesus Christ goes up, gets his armies from heaven, and comes back and fights the Antichrist and his armies, and the Armageddon campaign includes that final battle. And then here's one from Andy Wood, just to give you another guy, and just to show you that this is what they think. And I used to think this too. This is Dr. Andy Woods and Jim McGowan. It says, what does Zechariah 12:3 say? We just talked about, remember, the burdensome stone to the nations, and don't try to move it because it'll grievously wound you, international community, when you assemble against it.
Right, and then you explained also that it was basically the nations meddling again regarding the status of Jerusalem.
Yeah, because it's in that day, in what day? In that day that the Arabs, the evil neighbors, are going to lay siege against Judah and Jerusalem. In that day that they're going to be defeated, they're going to be unsuccessful, as the Israeli Defense Forces will just devour them. And we're not talking about a skirmish. We're talking about it's over. When it's over, they're never going to be able to come back after Jerusalem. They're never going to fight against Israel again. And that did not happen in 1948, which is what some people suggest, like Amir Sarfati. Because back in 1967, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, members of Psalm 83, came back against Israel, and again in 1973. We're talking about in Zechariah 12, verse 6. If we're pinpointing the appropriate populations as Psalm 83, they're done. Once they're defeated, God's going to divinely intervene, level the playing field, work in concert with the Israeli Defense Forces, and they're done once and for all. And that's clearly what Psalm 83 says at the end of it. It says basically, confound them, make them perish. Remember Jeremiah 12, verses 17 said they will utterly be plucked up and destroyed, the evil neighbors. So that's going to be done when it's done. Andy Wood says, what does Zechariah 12:3 say? It will come about in that day that I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all peoples. All who lift it will be severely injured, and all the nations of the earth will be gathered against it. All the peoples, doesn't that include everyone, including the United States? So see, they're throwing in that that's going to be Zechariah 12:6, where we just saw the Israeli Defense Forces are going to take out the Arabs. They're saying they're going to take out the United States and all these other places as well, because they think it's all the nations. All the nations of the earth will be gathered against it. And how many times does God have to say something for us to get it down? I mean, I think once is enough, but he basically then through Zechariah repeats himself a chapter or so later in Zechariah chapter 14, verses 2-3. So see, here's, I think unknowingly, I mean, I'm not trying to say these guys haven't done their research, but I think what they're basically not realizing that they're saying is that, I'm going to read Zechariah 14, verse 2 in just a second. They're connecting Zechariah 12, verse 3, when the nations meddle at the time of the siege of the Arabs against Judah and Jerusalem. They're connecting that with Zechariah chapter 14, which is clearly dealing with, in my estimation, a different Jerusalem scenario. Remember that Jerusalem in Zechariah chapter 12 is, the Lord is making it a cup of trembling to the Arab countries. And they try to lay siege and they lose. Their siege is unsuccessful. But now we're going to see in Zechariah chapter 14 a successful siege on Jerusalem. And we're told in Zechariah chapter 14,
which is Armageddon.
Yeah, I agree with Andy Woods and Hitchcock and John Wolvert and many other people who try to make these connections, as you and I also did before this program, right? Actually, I've been interpreting it this way since my Psalm 83 book back in 2013. It says, behold, the day of the Lord is coming, and your spoil will be divided in your midst, for I will gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem. So we're going to see all those nations, international community is going to be gathered to battle against Jerusalem. That's going to happen at the Armageddon scenario. The city shall be taken. So we got a successful siege, not an unsuccessful siege. The houses will be rifled and the women ravished. It's going to be a horrendous situation for the Jewish people around Jerusalem at that time. Half of the city shall go into captivity. So basically, we have two different scenarios in my estimation. You have a highly unsuccessful siege that the Lord gets in the middle of and empowers the Israeli Defense Forces to wipe out devour the Arab countries around them roundabout. Then you have a different scenario subsequently. I believe this would happen around the mid part of the tribulation. The Antichrist comes together with many of his armies against Jerusalem. They ransack the houses, they rape the women. And Jesus says, when you see the Antichrist going into the temple, which he will then go into the temple, the mid part of the tribulation in Matthew 24, verses 15, Jesus said, when you see that, the abomination of desolation is spoken by Daniel the prophet in the holy place. That's when the Antichrist is going to go into the temple, desecrate it, set up his image, declare himself to be called God above all things that are called God. And Jesus said, when you see that, you need to flee immediately. Flee to the mountains. And the mountains he's alluding to would be in Petra Jordan, southern Jordan, which Israel had possession of by that time after Psalm 83 when they annexed Jordan, which is part of the promised land, and they will annex Jordan in Jeremiah 49 verses 2 and Zephaniah verses 2:8-9. And anybody who's heeding what Christ said will flee. And ultimately we find in Zechariah 13:8 that when the Antichrist, the reason he's warning them to flee is because he foreknows that the Antichrist is going to try to commit the final genocidal attempt of the Jewish people. And that sort of triggers the whole campaign of Armageddon. Armageddon is not really a battle. Armageddon is a campaign, and I put 11 phases of it. It culminates in some major battles in parts of Jordan and around Jerusalem, etc. like that. But Armageddon is where the Mount Megiddo, Harmageddon, H-A-R, Megiddo is how it's in the American Standard Version. It means the Mount Megiddo. It's the Jezreel Valley. It's a massive valley where they will assemble. The kings of the east will go there. That's what we find out in Revelation 16, verses 14, I think it is. The river Euphrates dries up with the sixfold judgment. The kings of the east come, massive armies coming to join the Antichrist, etc. But I believe at the mid part of the tribulation, the Antichrist takes over Jerusalem, ravishes the houses, rapes the women. Then he goes into the temple, and Jesus says, "Flee when you see that." Because in Zechariah 13:8, we're told 2/3 of the Jewish people in the land will be killed, they'll be cut off. But 1/3, they call them the faithful remnant, will come through that. And that's the faithful remnant that Jesus will return for, that will be in Petra. And what happens at the end of the tribulation period, the final stages of the Armageddon campaign, when the Antichrist has assembled his vast armies in the Jezreel Valley, they're going to march around. They're going to skirt around east of the Dead Sea down the King's Highway. I point this out, pinpoint with accuracy, actually the deployment path of the Antichrist and many of his armies, his troops. They're going to skirt around the Dead Sea into Jordan, which will be possessed by Israel at that time, to try to get the final third of the Jewish remnant hiding in Petra, Jordan, and the rock fortress down there in southern Jordan. It's the southern part of the mountains, the southern part of Jordan. And they're going to go to Bozrah, which is now modern-day Bozrah. We find out in Isaiah 34 and Isaiah 63. That's where they're headed. They're going to come to Bozrah, which is modern-day Bozrah. It's at the northern part of those mountains. It's where they would make their final deployment for an attack to go down to Petra and get the final remnant. And when this happens, the Jewish remnant is going to shout out, realize Jesus Christ is the Messiah. They're going to shout, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," which will fulfill the mandate of Matthew 23, where Jesus said, "You will not see me again," to the leaders of Israel, until you say that. "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And they're going to do that. And Hosea 5:15 tells us they will do this. It says, "I will return to my place." Jesus says, I'm quoting Hosea 5:15. "I will return to my place," which Jesus has returned to his place in heaven. And until they seek my face, which they will do that at the end of the tribulation. It says, "In their affliction, they will seek my face, and they will earnestly seek my face." So we're told that in the tribulation period at the end, when the Antichrist is barreling down with his armies into Bozrah, and there'll be a slaughter there, we're told in Isaiah 34, by Jesus Christ, they're going to say, we're doomed. 2/3 of our people, countrymen, have already been killed by this antics of this Antichrist and his armies. They've ravished the houses, they've raped the women, they're coming after us now. And they're going to say, our only hope is Jesus the Messiah. He is the Messiah. And they're going to beckon his return, and he's going to come for them. In Isaiah 63, verses 1-6, we're told that he comes single-handedly. It says, "Who is this that comes to Edom?" That area there, Bozrah and Petra, as in ancient Edom, southern Jordan, modern-day southern Jordan. It says, "Who is this comes from to Edom with blood-stained garments?" And it says, "It is I, mighty to save," referring to Jesus Christ the Messiah. "I come alone, no one is with me." And so single-handedly, this is the year of my redeemed, single-handedly, he destroys all of them himself. So remember, if we're going to think about that, this is the end, this is toward Armageddon. Now, the Jewish people, whatever's left of them, about 1/3 of them, they're refugees in exile. They're in a non-combatant mode. They've fled, and Jesus said you should flee. He said in Matthew 24:15, don't fight, but flee. So they're non-combatant, they're exiles. They're fearful for their very existence. And they beckon Jesus to come. He comes, and he single-handedly wins the war in Isaiah 63. Isaiah 34 says there's a great slaughter, a great sacrifice in Bozrah. It connects with Isaiah 63. And then so here he's got these exiles. He's going to bring them back to Jerusalem. Now, if we're going to try to connect Zechariah 12, verses 6, and Zechariah chapter 12, verses 2 and 3, etc., with the Israeli Defense Forces winning a war against all the nations at Armageddon with the Antichrist and the armies, how are they going to do that? When one, we find out Jesus does it himself in Isaiah 63. We also find that in Revelation chapter 19. It says, I come with my sword on a white horse, and I destroy these armies single-handedly. So we have two verses that Jesus does it single-handedly, not with the help of the Israeli Defense Forces, who at that point in time are non-existent. They're just exiles. So how are they going to be empowered in Zechariah 12, verses 6, to devour all the nations that people would suggest must be happening here? Like Andy Wood said, doesn't that include America or the kings of the East, etc.? they're not going to be able to do that because the point is they're separate events. Zechariah chapter 12, verses 6 is the Israeli Defense Forces making a siege against Judah and Jerusalem by the evil neighbors unsuccessful. Zechariah chapter 14 is a different story, verse 2. It's a successful siege. And the Israeli Defense Forces, and also remember in Zechariah chapter 14, too, it doesn't sound like Jerusalem's a burdensome stone that can't be moved, that'll fall back and grievously wound those that try to move it. No, there's no problem. There's no stone to be moved. They're just moving in and taking over the city. They're mowing it down. So basically, we've got all kinds of different reasons why we cannot connect, in my estimation, Zechariah 12, 1 through 9 through Zechariah 14 and Revelation 16 and Revelation 19 and Joel 3, which those latter ones, they are all part of Armageddon, but I don't believe Zechariah 12, 1 through 9 is. Another couple arguments we should probably address before we close, Janie, is the argument of in that day. Is that dealing with the day of the Lord, the tribulation period? And the other one is, what about the mourning that's going on in Zechariah 12, verses 10 through 14? Those are very important topics because it appears as though there's a pause. Zechariah 12, 1 through 9 would deal with, in my estimation, the unsuccessful siege by the Arab countries, the Israeli Defense Forces defeating them. And then there's a pause that goes into Zechariah 12, verses 10 through 14. Now remember, the Israeli Defense Forces have just seen their God divinely intervene, level the playing field, and they've won their war against the evil neighbors around them. They should be slam dunking the football in the end zone. They should be doing backflips. They should be jubilant. But then we find out, no, they're not, if you're going to try to connect this all to the same passage. And I don't. I put a gap here. Also now they're mourning. Why would they be mourning when they've just been victors and victorious? It makes no sense at all.
Very interesting.
Okay. The reason they're mourning is it goes on to say, I'll pour on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and supplication. Then they will look upon me whom they pierced. In other words, they're actually going to physically see him. Jesus Christ is going to come at the second coming. He's going to return. He's going to defeat the Antichrist and the armies at Armageddon. He's going to bring the Jewish remnant back into Israel. They're going to see him. It says they'll mourn for him like an only son and grieve for him as one grieves for a firstborn. They're going to realize he's the Messiah and that generationally rejection of him has caused great harm to the Jewish people. Matter of fact, a lot of the people that were killed by the Antichrist were probably family members of theirs. And they needed, it would have been nice if they would have beckoned him to come a whole lot sooner, but they wait till the very end until they realize that he is the Messiah and say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. They're going to be mourning for him, realizing he is the Messiah, like an only son. It says, and in that day, when Jesus has returned and they're realizing he died, he is the Messiah, and they're mourning for him. It says, in that day, there should be a great mourning in Jerusalem, like that. And Hammond talks about examples. And he goes on to say, and the land shall mourn every family by itself, the family of the house of David itself and the wives by themselves, the family of the house of Nathan itself and the wives by themselves, the family of the house of Levi. And he goes on talking about the family of Shaddai, and it says all the families. Basically, so what you have here is a resurrection. You have to have David in his house there. You have to have Nathan in his house there. You have to have Levi in his tribes there. So basically, the house of Levi. That's part of the millennial kingdom when the Old Testament saints are resurrected along with the tribulation saints. So that's an entirely different section that talks about ultimately Jesus is going to return. They're going to be mourning for him. They'll be resurrected Old Testament saints, etc. And I get into that in depth in my book called The Millennium Prophecies and the New Jerusalem.
Oh, okay.
Now, the last one I want to address, and thanks for letting me just continue to go on and on and on here.
No, it's very amazing.
I think this is groundbreaking, and I think it's very important. Some people try to use it to connect the Armageddon campaign with the Zechariah 12, 1 through 9, is the usage of in that day in Zechariah 12, verses 3, 4, 6, 8, and 11. Now, verses 3, 4, 6, and 8 in that day, it was talking about in the day of the siege of Judah and Jerusalem by the evil neighbors. Now, some people would say in that day has to be dealing with the day of the Lord, and that has to be dealing with Armageddon. Well, first of all, a lot of people believe the day of the Lord is the whole 7-year tribulation period, not just the last half or during the Armageddon campaign. So basically, it wouldn't necessarily involve Armageddon campaign would be the whole day of the Lord. So they say in that day has to be the tribulation period. I'm suggesting to you this happens before the tribulation period, Zechariah 12, 1 through 9. Matter of fact, a lot of these people who think it has to be in the day of the Lord would also say, well, wait a minute. I believe that when it says in that day in Ezekiel 38 verses 19 and Ezekiel 39 verses 11, that Gog and Magog invasion, they would say that in that day it happens before the tribulation. A lot of those people believe Ezekiel 38 for various reasons happens before the tribulation, that Russian, Iranian, Turkish invasion of Israel for plunder and booty, massive prophecy. Also, some of these people like Andy Woods and Mark Hitchcock, they believe Isaiah 17 already found fulfillment in 732 by the Assyrian Empire. And it clearly says in Isaiah 17, 4, 7, and 9, in that day. So they would actually say that already found past fulfillment. Matter of fact, John Wolford, in his book, Every Prophecy of the Bible, tells us that in that day was used quite commonly in passages that have already found historical fulfillment. I'll give you a couple examples. In Amos 8, 1 through 14, Wolford says this reference to in that day was fulfilled in the captivity period. Page 124 in Jeremiah 8, 1 through 3, those who dishonored God by worshiping idols would have their bones removed from their graves and exposed to the sun and moon as a token of God's judgment. This was fulfilled in that day. He talks about it in, again, Isaiah 7, verses 18 through 25, if they want to write, your viewers want to write this down. And also in Jeremiah chapter 4, verses 1 through 31, in that day. These are all historically fulfilled things, where it says in the Bible, in that day. And we have historical proof, as Woolward puts forward, that happened in that day historically during the captivities, etc. So that argument, to me, is one of the final arguments we had to address, but it still does not refute what we're saying here in the interpretation, that in that day that the Arab countries, the evil neighbors, are going to be utterly plucked up because they're going to make a final attempt to lay siege on Judah and Jerusalem. God's going to intervene in that day. God's going to empower the Israeli Defense Forces in that day. And because the Israeli Defense Forces are not fighting wars in the tribulation period, it has to be before the tribulation period. And why are they not fighting wars in the tribulation period? Because tribulation period goes in two compartments. The first half, 3.5 years. The second half, 3.5 years. In the first half, the Jewish people are living in a pseudo-peace because they feel they've got a covenant of peace confirmed by the Antichrist in Daniel chapter 9.
Unwalled villages.
The covenant that gets confirmed in Daniel 9:27 and Isaiah 28 verses 15 is what starts this Daniel's 70th week, the tribulation period for 7 years. In the first half, they're at peace. They feel they got peace because of this covenant. It's a pseudo-peace because it gets broken in the mid part of the tribulation when Zechariah 14:2 happens and the armies gather against Jerusalem, ransack the houses, take over Jerusalem, take it captive, etc. That's when Jesus says, flee. He doesn't say fight. He says, Matthew 24, verses 15, flee when you see that happen. So in the first half, they're complacent. They can't even stop the Antichrist from taking over Jerusalem and going in the temple. The second half, they're not fighting. They're fleeing for their lives as the Antichrist is going to try to commit genocide. So they're not fighting in the first half, and they're not fighting in the second half. They're not fighting in the millennium, the Israeli Defense Forces, because we're told in Micah chapter 4 that there'll be no more war learned in the Messianic kingdom, that the swords will be turned into plowshares and the spears will be turned into pruning hooks. So they're not fighting in the millennium, and they're not fighting in the tribulation. They have to be fighting before the tribulation. And I think that what we're going to see happen here is Israel and its war with Hamas is going to start to escalate. As we talked about earlier in the show, Israel is already talking about moving Hezbollah back north of the Litani River because they've got to get their Israeli citizens who are living in hotels right now that belong back in their cities of the north, get them back in their homes, and they're not going there because they're concerned about another massacre. So I think we need to be watching for a potential escalation of this Middle East war into the proxies of Iran, ultimately into Psalm 83 and the destruction of Damascus in Isaiah chapter 17. And that's not even to mention another prophecy which is in Jeremiah chapter 49, dealing with Iran in verses 34 through 39, which maybe in another show, Jamie, we can tackle that one. But Iran is a subject of dual prophecies in the end times. Ezekiel 38, under the banner of Persia, and Jeremiah 49, verses 34 through 39, under the banner of Elam. And that's where Iran is probably going to get hit with a disaster as part of that prophecy, engaging with their proxies in a war with Israel.
I I am like so blown away because I feel like, your book is really a Bible study. I have to sit with the book and just read a little bit at a time and study the scriptures. I mean, this forces you to study the scriptures because the way you understand Bible prophecy and the future wars, I have never ever seen anyone explain it the way you do. So can you tell everyone where they can find your book? The future war prophecies and other materials, what your website is.
Yes, thank you again, Janie, for having me on your program. The website is prophecydepot.com, Prophecy Depot, like homedepot.com. We got the products online store we got there. You can find it there. We got lots of my articles and videos, like this one will be posted on our YouTube channel, etc. You can connect to those social networks on our website as well. Janie, thank you so much for having me on the program. I think it's important that people dive deep into these studies because God wants us to know what's going to happen. These are ancient prophecies that are going to roll off their parchments and pound down on the pavement. And they're not just going to affect the Middle East. They're globally impacting, and everyone will be affected. So we need all of your viewers to be, paying attention to Bible prophecy and using it as a witnessing tool to equip themselves and to evangelize to their loved ones.
Yeah, and speaking of evangelizing, I've heard you say, of course, God loves all the people. He loves the Arabs. He loves the Jewish people. And I thought it was really, really neat. I heard you say how the Lord is appearing to so many Arabs too, supernaturally. So, I mean, he loves everyone.
He does, matter of fact, in Iran as an example, as you know, it's so heavily persecuted by the mullahs and ayatollahs. It's actually the fastest growing evangelical population in the world. A stat came out a few years ago growing at a rate of 19.8%. Dreams, visions, miracles, and healings. Many Muslims are former Muslims now because they've converted to Christianity. Supernatural evangelism is taking place over there, a place where missionaries can scarcely get into nor want to go to. But God, because he loves them, is rolling up his sleeves and supernaturally accomplishing the will of his heart and bringing the lost, these Iranians, to himself. And that is the character of God. And that's why he put together the roadmap plan we talked about for peace in Jeremiah chapter 12, verses 14 through 17. The compassionate plan. He said, I want them to dwell, I'm paraphrasing, I want the Arabs and the Jews to dwell together in the midst of each other at peace. They can have their heritages and their cultures, but they need to swear by me, the God of the Bible, like they taught the Jews back at Jeremiah's time to swear by Baal, the false god. So it was a compassionate plan, even though they were evil neighbors, even though they needed to be plucked out of their land that now became Israel. He still loved them and had a compassionate plan in place 2,500 years ago. That we've seen part one find fulfillment already in 20th century, and we're going to see part two find fulfillment in the 21st century. And unfortunately, it's not a land for peace still. It's an utter plucking up and destroying of those nations that are worshiping Allah, that are coming against the Jews. Will make a final attempt to lay siege against Judah and Jerusalem.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show, and definitely having you back again because I love learning. This is amazing stuff. So thank you, and for those watching, please share this video and please subscribe and put a like. Thank you.